All right, get ready, everyone. Today, we are going to take a deep dive into a fascinating topic, the power of thinking in English. You know that feeling when you are trying to have a conversation, but it's like there's this constant translator going on in your head? That's what we're going to try to tackle today.
Yeah, it's like you are trying to run a race but with weights strapped to your ankles. And that translation process can really hold you back from being able to engage in conversations.
Yeah, exactly. So how do we ditch those mental ankle weights and just start thinking in English naturally? It feels like such a huge task.
I know it can seem that way, but really, it is more about building consistent habits than like some magical overnight transformation. Think of like training for a marathon. You wouldn't expect to be able to run 26 miles on your first day out, would you?
That's a great analogy. So we are training for a fluency marathon. What's the first step?
Well, the first step is actually pretty simple. Start small. Instead of just going through your day passively, try to make a conscious effort to label everyday objects, but in English.
So like instead of just seeing a table, I would think wooden table, dining table, or maybe antique table, depending on what it looks like.
Yeah, that's it. It's kind of like you're flexing those mental muscles and you're getting more comfortable using English vocabulary in your everyday life. And the best part is you can do it anywhere, anytime. So, like waiting in line at the grocery store, think of all the things that you see and label them. Cooking dinner, same thing.
Like turning your brain into a walking English dictionary.
Yes, exactly. And as you start labeling things, you might find that there are some gaps in your vocabulary. Maybe you see a certain type of flower and realize you don't know the word for it in English. Boom, there you go. You have just found a new word to learn.
So it's not only about using the words that we already know, but we're actually actively expanding our vocabulary as we go. So how do we go beyond just labeling things and start to think in full sentences in English?
Well, that is where the visualization comes in. So instead of thinking about individual words, try to build a word picture in your mind. Let's say you are thinking of the word beach. Don't stop at just the word itself. Imagine it. The golden sand, the crashing waves, the smell of the salty air. Maybe children are building sandcastles.
So it's like instead of just a definition, we're creating a sensory experience. I can see
Right.
how that makes the word more memorable.
Exactly. And there's actually research to back this up. Our brains are wired to remember things better when they are connected to vivid images and emotions. So next time that you learn a new word, don't just memorize the definition, make a mental movie out of it.
Wow, this is making me completely rethink how I learn new words. Now, speaking of remembering words, I have realized that context is so important in how well I remember new vocabulary.
Absolutely. Our brains are really amazing at making these connections. When you learn a new word or a phrase in a specific context, it's like you're taking a mental snapshot that you can then access later on.
It's like that time I learned the word serendipity while I was reading an article about chance encounters. And now, every time I hear that word, I picture that article and I remember that feeling of surprise and delight.
That's a perfect example. So try to pay attention to the context in which you are encountering new vocabulary. So if you are reading a book, take a moment to really visualize the scene, the characters, how it made you feel. And if you're listening to a podcast, imagine what the speaker's voice sounds like, or think about what the setting might be.
Like creating a mental anchor for that word so it sticks in our memory. So we have talked about building vocabulary, word pictures, and the context. But how do we actually start to string those individual words into sentences?
Well, this is where things start to get really interesting. So a really simple but effective technique is to just start with basic sentence structures, like I see, or I feel, or I want, or I think, and then just build from there.
So instead of thinking sunset, I might think, I see a beautiful sunset with streaks of pink and orange across the sky.
Yeah, exactly. So you are taking those words and turning them into a complete thought. And don't be afraid to practice these sentences out loud.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's one thing to think in English in our heads, but saying it out loud takes it to a new level.
Absolutely. The more you speak, the more confident and fluent you'll become. And always remember that if you make mistakes, that's okay. It's all part of the process.
Such an important reminder. I think a lot of people get hung up on that fear of making mistakes. But really, mistakes are just stepping stones to fluency.
Exactly. And then, as you get more comfortable with these basic sentences, you can then start to experiment with more complex structures and try to explore the nuances of different English phrases.
Nuances. Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, you see, English, like any language, has a lot of different subtle shades of meaning. So, for example, the phrase to be in over one's head can have different meanings depending on the context.
Yeah, I can see that. So if someone says, I'm in over my head at work, It probably means they have way too much work to do.
Exactly. But if you're talking about, say, someone who's trying to learn a new hobby like surfing, and they say, I'm in over my head, it could mean that they are literally struggling to stay above the water.
So it's the same phrase, but the meaning is totally different depending on the situation. That's so interesting. How do we start to pick up on those subtle differences?
It all comes down to paying attention to the context and really thinking about the speaker's intentions. What's the situation? What's their tone of voice? What about their body language? All these little cues can help you figure out what they really mean. And don't be afraid to ask for clarification if you are unsure about something.
That's a great point. It's much better to just ask than to completely misinterpret what someone is trying to say. So we have talked about vocabulary building, using visualization, understanding the context, and starting to understand these nuances. So what is next in our Fluency Marathon training plan?
Well, the next step is all about immersion, surrounding yourself with as much English as possible.
Okay, I think I know where this is going. Watch movies, listen to podcasts, read books, right?
You got it. But it's not just about passively consuming this content, it's about actively engaging with the language. So when you're watching a movie, don't just focus on the plot. Pay attention to the dialogue, the different accents, and the slang.
So like turning everyday activities into learning opportunities. Instead of mindlessly scrolling through social media, maybe switch to reading articles in English or follow some English-speaking creators.
Exactly. It's all about making English a part of your daily life rather than something that you only do when you are studying.
Okay, this is starting to feel less like a chore and more like an adventure. So we're immersing ourselves in English through different mediums. What else can we do to help train for fluency?
Well, think about what motivates you in other areas of your life. So, like, if you are trying to get fit, you might join a gym or find a workout buddy to keep you accountable. You can do the same thing with learning a language.
So we need to find our English-speaking tribe people who can support us along the way.
Exactly. Find a language partner or join a conversation group or connect with other English learners online. You'd be surprised how much more motivated you'll feel when you have other people who are on the same journey as you.
And plus, it provides an opportunity to actually practice having conversations in English, which is so important. I have noticed that my fluency really improves when I am able to have real conversations.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to explore topics that really interest you. If you love cooking, for example, try to find some cooking shows or blogs or YouTube channels in English.
So turning our passions into fluency fuel. Love it. It's crazy how much easier it is to learn when you're actually interested in the material.
It is. And by doing that, you'll naturally encounter new vocabulary and you'll start to understand English grammar without even realizing it.
Sneaking in a workout while having fun. Now, I know we have covered a lot already, but we're just getting started. Before we wrap up this first part, I want to touch on something I think a lot of language learners struggle with. What about those moments where you just get stuck? When you can't remember a word or you stumble over a phrase and you just feel like you've hit a wall. Any advice on how to deal with that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we've all been there, right? Those moments are totally normal. They are a part of the learning process. And actually, believe it or not, they can be incredibly valuable. They can be super valuable. Those moments where you feel stuck, it's like hitting the gym for your brain.
Okay, I like that. So how can these frustrating moments actually be good for our language learning?
Well, when you hit a roadblock like that in a conversation, it forces your brain to work a lot harder, right? So you have to start searching for other ways to express your thoughts, and this actually strengthens those connections in your brain and makes you more resourceful.
Oh, so it's like a mental detour that helps us to discover new routes and pathways in our brains.
That's a great way to put it. If you're always taking the same easy route, you're not really challenging yourself or exploring any new territory. But then when you run into an obstacle and you have to find a different way to go, well, then you're expanding your mental map and you are becoming a more adaptable communicator.
Okay, I love that analogy. So then, practically speaking, what are some ways that we can handle those moments when we just can't think of the right word to say?
Well, one technique is to try using synonyms or try describing the word that you can't quite remember. So let's say you're trying to say, I'm feeling exhausted, but you just can't think of the word exhausted. You could say something like, I'm feeling really tired, or I just don't have any energy left.
So it's all about finding workarounds and using the words that we do know how to say to bridge that gap.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to use gestures or even try to draw a little picture if that helps you to get your point across. The important thing is to just keep that conversation flowing and not let one little missing word derail you completely.
It's like we're building a bridge with whatever words we can find. Even if it's not the prettiest bridge. What if you just can't think of any synonyms or ways to describe the word? What do we do then?
Well, that's when it's helpful to have some kind of system, like a mental sticky note. So whenever you come across a word or a phrase that you want to learn, just make a little mental note of it. You can even write it down if that's easier for you. And then you commit to looking it up later.
So we are basically turning those stumbling blocks into learning opportunities. So instead of getting frustrated, we are using them as fuel for our vocabulary expansion.
Exactly. And when you do look up that word later, don't just glance at the definition. Really dive into it. Explore all of the different meanings it can have and check out some example sentences. Maybe watch a video or listen to a podcast where it's being used.
It's like we are taking a deep dive into the meaning and the history of that word, which will help us remember it.
Right. And speaking of memory, I kind of want to shift gears for a second. Let's talk about the emotional side of language learning. Because it is not just about memorizing words and grammar rules, it's about learning a whole new way to think and express yourself.
Yeah, it's like stepping into a totally different mindset, which can be exciting and a little scary at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And it's totally normal to feel a whole bunch of different emotions throughout this journey. You might feel excited, frustrated, you might doubt yourself, you might even feel a little bit vulnerable. It's all part of it.
Oh yeah, for sure. I remember when I first started learning English, I was so embarrassed about my accent and making mistakes. I felt like everyone was judging me.
That is so common, especially when you're first starting out. But, you have to remember that everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers. And those mistakes are actually a sign that you are challenging yourself and getting out of your comfort zone.
So we need to look at those mistakes as part of the learning process and not like we're failing. How do we deal with all of those negative emotions that can sometimes come up?
I think one of the best things you can do is to connect with other people who are learning English too. Sharing your experiences with others who really understand what you are going through can make such a big difference. Whether it's your challenges or your successes, talking about it with other learners can really help.
It's like having a support system to keep you going and to remind you that you are not alone on this journey.
Exactly. And don't forget to celebrate your successes along the way. Even the little wins. Did you have a conversation where you felt more confident? Or maybe you understood a whole movie in English without subtitles. Those are huge wins.
Like giving yourself a high five for making progress. Let's switch gears a little bit again. Creating a learning environment that works for you is so important, right? Because not everyone can learn in a traditional classroom setting.
You are so right. There is no one right way to learn a language. It's about finding what works best for you and for your learning style. Some people are visual learners, others are auditory learners, and some people learn best by doing things hands-on. It's all about figuring out what works for you and your style.
So how do we create a more personalized learning environment? What are your thoughts?
Well, one thing that I have found really helps is to incorporate your own personal interests into your learning. If you love music, why not listen to songs in English and try to figure out what the lyrics are saying?
Or if you love food, you could watch cooking shows or
Mhm.
even read recipes in English. We're turning our hobbies into language labs.
I love it. And when you do that, you're not only expanding your vocabulary and your understanding of grammar, but you are also immersing yourself in the culture and connecting with the language on a much deeper level.
So cool. A lot of people use apps and online resources to learn English. What are your thoughts on those?
I think they can be great tools, especially for learning new words and practicing grammar, but you have to remember that they are just tools. They aren't going to magically make you fluent.
So don't depend only on apps to learn, right?
Mhm.
We need to balance using digital tools with real-life interactions.
That's exactly right. Think of apps as like a supplement to your learning, not the main course. They can help you build a really strong foundation, but if you really want to master the language, you need to get out there and use it in real life.
So we're talking about having actual conversations, reading books and articles, watching movies, and surrounding ourselves with people who speak English. Okay, so you said earlier that learning a language is kind of like running a marathon, right? But marathons are tough. How do we stay motivated and not burn out along the way?
That's a really great question because it is easy to get discouraged when you feel like you're not making progress or you're not learning as quickly as you want to. But, even marathon runners have to pace themselves and find ways to stay energized. It's the same with learning a new language.
So what are some strategies for staying motivated and avoiding that language learning fatigue?
Well, I would say one of the best things is to set realistic goals for yourself. Don't try to do too much at once. It's much better to break your learning up into smaller, more manageable chunks.
So instead of trying to be fluent in like a month, maybe we should focus on really learning one specific grammar rule or expanding our vocabulary in a specific area.
Exactly. And don't forget to give yourself little rewards along the way. Did you have a conversation with a native speaker and feel good about it? Treat yourself to a movie in English or maybe eat some food from an English-speaking culture.
It's like giving ourselves those runner's high moments during our language learning journey. I know we've talked a lot about the mental and emotional parts of learning, but what about the physical side of it?
Ah, you're talking about actually making the sounds of the language, right? Our mouths and our vocal cords need practice too.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes it feels like I'm fighting with my own tongue trying to get the pronunciation right. Do you have any tips for improving pronunciation and feeling more comfortable speaking out loud?
For sure. One of the most helpful things is to start paying attention to the rhythm and the intonation of English.
So it's not just about saying each word correctly, but how we put those sounds together and how our voices can change the meaning of what we are saying.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, think about it. Even if you say every single word perfectly, but you don't have the right rhythm or your voice doesn't go up and down at the right time, then people might not understand what you're trying to say.
It's like playing music. You
Mhm.
can hit all the right notes, but if the rhythm is off, then it's not going to sound right.
I like that. So, how do we work on the musicality of our English?
Well, one good way is to just listen to how native speakers talk. Pay attention to how they emphasize certain parts of words, how their voices go up and down, and how they use pauses. It's like we're trying to become vocal chameleons. We're changing our voices to match the sounds and the patterns of native speakers.
Exactly. And it's okay to even exaggerate a little bit at first. It might feel kind of weird, but it can really help you train your mouth and get a better feeling for how English should flow.
It's like practicing those dance moves in the mirror before you go out dancing.
So, what are some ways that we can improve our pronunciation and intonation? Are there specific things we can do or resources we can use?
Oh, absolutely. There are so many great resources available online and in libraries. You can find pronunciation guides, videos, even apps that break down English sounds and give you exercises to practice. You can even record yourself speaking and then listen back to it and see if you can hear any areas that you want to work on.
That's a great idea. Sometimes it's hard to hear your own pronunciation mistakes until you listen to a recording of yourself. I know some people feel self-conscious about their accent and they worry that they will always sound foreign. What do you think about that? You know, I think it's important to remember that having an accent is totally fine. It's a part of who you are and where you're from, and it adds to the beauty of English.
So we shouldn't worry too much about trying to get rid of our accents completely.
No, not really. I think the goal is to be clear and easy to understand, but you don't have to sound like someone from a textbook. And of course, if there are certain sounds that make it hard for people to understand you, then it's good to work on those. But it's okay to embrace your own unique voice and let your personality come through.
I love that. It's about finding that balance between being clear and being yourself. Now, before we finish up this deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned before about consistency being the key to becoming fluent. Could you talk about that a little more?
Absolutely. Consistency is what brings all of these different strategies together and makes them work. Think of it like exercising. You can't just work out one time and expect to see results. You need to do it regularly to get stronger.
So it's not about trying to study for hours and hours right before you need to use English. It's about making English a regular part of your daily life, even if it's just for a few minutes each day.
Yes, exactly. Maybe you read a news article in English while you are drinking your coffee in the morning, or listen to a podcast while you are commuting. Maybe even have a quick conversation with a language partner before bed. It's all about finding those little moments where you can fit English into your day.
It's like weaving English into our lives instead of just keeping it separate.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is that even if you only spend a little bit of time each day, those minutes really start to add up over time. It's like compound interest. The more you invest, the more you get back.
So we're slowly building our fluency fortune, little by little.
I love that. And then as you start to see those results, those moments where you can easily express yourself in English or understand a native speaker without having to work too hard, It creates a positive cycle that motivates you to keep going.
Like reaching those milestones during a marathon. They give you that extra push to keep going.
That's a great way to think about it. So, before we wrap up today, I want to leave you with a little challenge. What is one small thing that you can do today to make English more a part of your life? It doesn't have to be anything big or take a lot of time. Maybe you could change the language settings on your phone to English or watch a 5-minute video on YouTube in English. The most important thing is to just do something, even if it's small, to keep the momentum going.
Every step forward gets us closer to that fluency finish line.
That's right. And remember that the journey is just as important as the destination. So enjoy the challenge, celebrate those wins, and have fun becoming a more confident English speaker.
That is great advice. Thank you so much for joining us on this amazing deep dive into the world of thinking in English. We hope you learned some valuable tips and that you feel inspired to try some of them out. Remember that becoming fluent takes time and everyone learns at their own pace, and every step you take is a win. So keep practicing and we'll see you next time.